The United Nations warns of an unprecedented humanitarian crisis as Israel continues to block all humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Israel announced a major escalation this week in its military operation in Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the goal is to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages. It's believed 21 of the remaining 59 hostages are still alive. In the last 2 days, Israeli airstrikes hit a packed restaurant and a UN school being used as a shelter, killing dozens of people, including women and children. For over 2 months, Israel has blocked food and medical supplies from entering the enclave. With the food shortages, community kitchens as well as bakeries have shut down. The United Nations says thousands of children are facing an increased risk of starvation, illness and death. For more on the humanitarian crisis, let's turn to our panel. Joining us from Ontario, Canada, is Michael Lynk. He's a Professor Emeritus of Law at Western University and a former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian Territory. And from Geneva, Margaret Harris is the spokesperson for the World Health Organization. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Margaret, it's been 9 weeks since Israel unilaterally violated the ceasefire and blocked all food, humanitarian and medical supplies from getting into Gaza. I mean, daily we see and hear horrific reports of children close to death because of starvation. What is the WHO's assessment of conditions in Gaza right now?
And they're exactly as you describe, horrific. The needs, the medical needs are huge, growing by the minute, not just with the starvation, but the overcrowding leading to all kinds of infectious diseases, the fear and anxiety, and the bombing. You just described the bombings continually causing trauma, requiring surgery, requiring treatment. But the hospitals and the health clinics are rapidly running out of all supplies. The information I have is that the medical supplies are up to 60% medical disposables, which is things like all the swabs, all the intravenous catheters, or the sutures, all the things you need to basically keep on providing surgical care. And 40% of routine vaccinations are completely out of stock. And up to 40% of essential medicines are completely out of stock. So basically, you're asking the health care workers in the healthcare system to manage a massive load, much greater than most parts of the world, with absolutely nothing.
Margaret, this has been going on for a long time, and there was a brief respite during the 2 months of the ceasefire. But are we getting to something of a tipping point right now where we are going to see vast numbers of people dying because of starvation?
They are dying. The information, again, I have is that we've got 4 treatment centres for severe acute malnutrition, and we're not seeing the number of children we actually expect to see there. We know that the levels of severe acute malnutrition are very high, and that we expect that children with medical complications particularly would be rushed to those centres, but they're not getting there because of the insecurity. They're afraid to even come to the hospitals, or they simply can't. So this tells us that those children are dying in these terrible conditions that their families are trying to survive in.
Michael, there was an op-ed in the New York Times earlier this week written by Sean Carroll. He's president of the American Near East Refugee Aid. That's a non-profit group. And in that op-ed, he said, a full-blown humanitarian emergency in Gaza is no longer looming. It is here, and it is catastrophic. We look at Western countries, Michael, which are the main allies of Israel, the main backers of Israel. They appear either powerless to stop this or indifferent. How does one explain this?
Well, let's remember that the United Nations has declared Israel in violation of international law for over 45 years, beginning in the late 1970s at the Security Council with the votes of many of these Western powers was saying that Israel was in violation of international law because of its building of its settlements, because it would not accept that the laws of occupation apply to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And yet these violations continued decade after decade, with the global North doing very little to stop this. And now we're at probably the most catastrophic moment in this long history of Israel and Palestine over the last almost 80 years. And we see very little reaction coming from the global North, aside from declarations to say Israel is in severe breach of international law. Keep in mind that we've had prohibitions against the use of starvation of the civilian population since the Geneva Conventions of 1949. And that's been reinforced by the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court in 1998. The use of starvation is a war crime, a crime against humanity. Indeed, when the International Criminal Court issued its arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant in November of this past year, the use of starvation against the civilian population was one of the key indictments against them. It's hard to explain the indifference of the global North towards this, but it continues with this long pattern.
That's right, Michael. In fact, this inaction by Western countries has been condemned even by the very conservative Financial Times in London. It called it shameful. So, Michael, what is your best hope for what happens next?
Well, that the world's conscience will finally be pricked by what we're seeing coming out of Gaza. I mean, these pictures of young kids in full-blown famine are heartbreaking, and you think this would move the world, particularly the global North, to take more decisive action. Israel has continued with its 57, almost 58-year-old occupation because it's paid very little cost politically and diplomatically for this. And it's continued with this 19-month-old war on Gaza because it's felt very little cost. We still have large supplies of arms going to Israel from Germany and the United States in particular. Countries in the West are maintaining their diplomatic and trade and investment relationships with Israel. Only when Israel begins to feel a severe cost to its policies towards the Palestinians will we ever hope to see some sort of change with respect to Israeli policy and hope for the 14 million Palestinians and Jews who live in the Holy Land.
Margaret, there are some doctors from the United States as well as the United Kingdom and other countries that have been able to get into Gaza to try and help there. In fact, there was one doctor who is from Chicago, and he appeared on television here, and he said he saw children with shocking injuries, and there's nothing they can do. There's nothing that the doctors were able to do. There are some that they're able to save, others they could not. What is the state of healthcare? I mean, you were telling us a moment ago about the lack of vaccinations, the lack of medical supplies. Is there anything available?
There are still 21 hospitals that are functioning, extraordinary to say, but they're not functioning as you or I would understand a hospital. They're doing their very best, but many of them can really only function as aid stations at best. And indeed, what you described, healthcare workers every day are in this horrible position where they can't do very much to save a life. They either can't do it because the injuries are so horrific and they don't have the expertise or the experience to deal with the specific vascular injuries and the complications, or they simply don't have the equipment. Right now, as I said, they're running out of everything. So indeed, they do their best, but we know that there are at least 1,000 children who've had limb amputations, and quite often those amputations have happened because that was the only way to save that child's life at the time. Normally, you could do a lot more to save that limb. Now, those children are going to, if they live, if they survive the starvation that they're currently being forced to endure, if they live, they will be disabled for the rest of their life. And I do not understand how the world can stand by and watch children being maimed, being destroyed, their minds being broken by the terror they're experiencing every day. For us in the international humanitarian community, we cannot understand how the world can allow this to continue to go on.
Michael, when we look at the destruction in Gaza, it's been flattened. I mean, there's something else that's been demolished as well, isn't it? It's international law. I mean, is there any semblance of international law right now, Michael? I mean, we see that the International Court of Justice, for one, and the International Criminal Court have acted, but how effective has that been?
Well, look, I have to agree with you there. International law was never meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain. We do have international institutions, the two courts that you've mentioned, both of them based in The Hague, who've taken, heard both requests for arrest warrants, as the International Criminal Court has issued, and has heard now 3 cases, one involving the charge of genocide brought by South Africa, the second of an advisory opinion declaring the Israeli occupation to be unlawful that was issued last July, and now a case that was argued last week at the court with respect to the obligations that Israel owes to the international community and to the UN to allow UN and humanitarian agencies to function as they should in this occupation and in this genocide in Gaza. But at the end of the day, international law is doing what it can in order to lay to us the strict rules of how wars and occupations are to be applied. It's international politics that is the issue here. The international courts in The Hague don't have their own armies. They don't have their own police. They depend upon the United Nations, and particularly the UN Security Council, to be able to enforce their orders.
Right.
And that brings us to the issue of the UN, of the US and its veto over any criticism against Israel. And that's where we're stuck right now.
Margaret, as far as what the United Nations agencies can do in Gaza, Israel has said that it wants to control the distribution of humanitarian aid inside Gaza, but it doesn't want to use those UN agencies. It wants to use US contractors, American contractors. The United Nations has condemned that, this proposal. This is what Jens Lauke with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs had to say. Let's listen.
It appears to be a deliberate attempt to weaponize the aid. And we have warned against that for a very long time, that aid should be provided based on humanitarian need to whomever needs it, targeting those who need it most first.
So, Margaret, the United Nations says Israel's plan rejects fundamental humanitarian principles. What is the impact of Israel's refusal to work with any UN agency?
Well, in fact, again, they're in violation of international humanitarian law. As the occupying power, they're obliged to ensure the population has access to healthcare, has access to supplies, has access to food, and yet all those things are being blockaded. We've got 30 trucks sitting on the border waiting to come over with medical supplies, and all the other UN agencies are similarly ready to come in immediately to help, and we're not being permitted to do so. And we are getting these stories of, oh, it's about diversion of aid. We all work inside the Gaza Strip. We work wherever we provide aid and ensure that we have it door to door. Basically, we deliver it. So there is this story is a nonsense. And indeed, the reason we object very much to this idea of having contractors providing aid from a certain spot, these are spots that are highly military controlled. You're driving the population into a very dangerous conflict zone in order to pick up the aid. You're not sure that everybody could get it. The vulnerable would not be able to get it because they would not be able to make the trip.
Right.
So it violates the basic humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence.
Margaret Harris, Michael Lynk, thanks for being with us. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he's alarmed by Israel's announcement to expand its ground operations in Gaza and is calling once again for an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages. Joining us now in the studio is Nabeel Khoury. He's a former US diplomat and the author of Bunker Diplomacy, an Arab American in the US Foreign Service, Personal reflections on 25 years of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Also with us from Jerusalem is Sarah Yael Hirschhorn. She's a historian at the University of Haifa and a fellow of the Jewish People Policy Institute. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Sarah, good to see you. Let me start with you. We just had our two guests earlier telling us about the dire situation in Gaza, where there are thousands of people facing starvation. The attacks continue. 59 people killed on Wednesday. Now, the Israeli cabinet has approved a plan for this expansion of its operations in Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the goal is to pressure Hamas to release the remaining hostages. But Hamas says there is no point in talks while the blockade remains. What is Israel's ultimate goal?
I think it's very difficult for the average Israeli to tell at this point. Israel has been at war in the Gaza Strip for over 18 months. They have not been able to accomplish their stated goal of defeating Hamas and demilitarizing the terrorist organization and decapitating its leadership. They've not been able to free the hostages either through military means or the remaining 24 living hostages through some further diplomatic process. And while remains no capable leadership of the Gaza Strip outside of an internationally recognized terrorist organization, it's unclear what a further Israeli operation or even some kind of lower level Israeli occupation will necessarily accomplish. And many parts of Israeli society do not support this plan.
Right, that was something I was going to ask you about, because this expansion that Prime Minister Netanyahu was talking about also includes the mobilization of reservists in Israel. Have you any indication of what public opinion is on this?
Well, first and foremost, we should say that if this operation is being sold as an attempt to liberate the hostages, the people who are the most determinedly against a further expansion of operation are the families of the hostages, who were actually dragged out of the Knesset chamber shortly before the vote and have complained time and time again that the Netanyahu administration has not listened to them, and that they fear that an expansion of military operations will indeed further endanger the lives of the 24 remaining hostages and probably never see the bodies of the 35 dead hostages that are being held by Hamas repatriated to Israel. Amongst the reservists, many who have spent more than 300 days in uniform, despite the fact that they run businesses, they have families, they are not full-time military officers, but in fact they are essentially weekend warriors, have made immense sacrifices to leave their daily life to return to military service, which many were, I think, happy to do after October 7th when they saw an imminent danger and an existential threat to the state of Israel. But we are seeing increasing dissatisfaction and even refusal to essentially show up for service on the part of reservists who really can't afford, literally or metaphorically, to continue this military campaign, especially without any promise that after 18 months, their service will actually achieve any stated or real goal other than keeping the Netanyahu administration in power.
Nabeel, good to see you as well, and glad to have you with us in the studio. Earlier on when I was talking with our guests, one of the guests made the point that Western countries have not done much to stop this. In fact, in many instances, they continue to supply arms to Israel. They've come under criticism, most recently from the Financial Times, as I mentioned. But why have there been no significant efforts by regional Arab leaders to stop this?
Sure, but first, just a quick comment on the current expansion, which you were discussing with Sarah.
Yeah.
Just as the right wing is now in charge of the US government, the right wing in Israel is in charge. And for both, this expansion has been the goal from the beginning. Jared Kushner went to visit Israel before the US elections.
Yeah.
And he saw a delectable piece of real estate in Gaza, which Trump has been very open about, saying that minus the Palestinian population, they could turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. And what is happening now is what the right wing in both countries has wanted all along. they're finally pushing as many of the Palestinians out of Gaza as they can. And the projects will follow. Now, the sad thing is that this is probably the worst humanitarian catastrophe and man-made famine and starvation since before World War II. The amount of violence is staggering. And to watch day in, day out, 50, 60, 100 people, mostly children, dying. And then those who don't die from the bullets die from lack of water, food, and medicine. That the world is watching. I don't exonerate anyone, starting with the Arab world. The Arab world has been pitifully silent. The countries that have exchanged embassies with Israel have not even recalled their ambassadors. Really, frankly, the Arab world is at a very low level. I mean, I compare it to the European Middle Ages. There are civil wars, there are cross-border wars, and there are uprisings. There's a lot of disaffection. But in the end of the day, I mean, regardless of what anybody does, the one who has the power is Israel. Either Israel stops what it's doing, or no one will stop it until it has killed the last Palestinian, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank.
And Nabeel, what are your thoughts on what the wider international community can do, as well as what seems to be the ineffectiveness of the current international legal structure to deal with this?
Well, legal structures, I'm afraid, have become totally irrelevant. Here in the US, the Trump administration ignores court orders left and right, unless it is in their favor and unless they control the court, as is the case with the Supreme Court. International agencies, international law, forget it. Both Israel and this administration ignore them completely. So they are ineffective. I think the only pressure can be perhaps harking back to South Africa. When the US changed its mind, the world descended on South Africa with serious sanctions, to the point where they were obliged to change their apartheid regime. I don't see the world or the US changing towards Israel in this fashion right now. So the only hope is that the left wing in Israel can rise and change.
What do you think, that there could be political changes, Sarah, in Israel that could force a change on what's taking place right now?
I don't think so. And it's very disappointing sitting here in Jerusalem to see very little movement happening in the upper echelons of power, and also that Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be a cat with 9 lives. Every time one of his rivals comes to challenge him, whether that was most recently Ronen Bar, the head of the security service, the Shabak, the Shin Bet, or several months ago, another military general who had been at one time a very key member of the war cabinet, but then broke with Netanyahu over his strategy, have come to resign from office or attempt to be fired, or to try to bring their case to the Supreme Court over illegal activity. Somehow Netanyahu always manages to wriggle out of it. For example, Ronen Bar has announced that he will rather quietly resign in about a month's time. And it seems that that scandal, like many others before it, and probably many others after it, will go away. Israel has a 4-year election cycle, and without someone or something collapsing this government internally, Israelis will have to still wait about another 2 years to be able to go to the polls. Unlike the mode of representation in the United States, Israelis don't have direct representation in the Knesset. They don't have a voice who speaks on behalf of their constituency, their geographic locale, even necessarily their opinions on a variety of issues. It's party politics, and unless party politicians are willing to pulled the trigger in collapsing the government, and there are deep-seated reasons why they are not willing to do so, there's very little room for the Israeli people to have a voice at the polls or really anywhere else.
Sarah, one other development, the Reuters news agency reports that there are very early talks right now on the possibility of the United States leading some kind of temporary post-war transitional authority in Gaza. It's going to be modeled, we are told, in a similar way that the coalition authority was modeled in Iraq during the war there. Would Israel support such a move?
Possibly, but I very strongly doubt that the U.S. military and the chief military brass is going to be interested in having American boots on the ground fighting and dying against Hamas. And if that was the intent,
I don't think, Sarah, that they're talking about a combat situation. I think they're talking about just a military authority taking over as some kind of administration in Gaza.
Well, look, I think the U.S. administration, as much as the Israeli administration, has been clear that there is no path forward without the removal of Hamas from power. So the first precursor to any kind of, I don't know, military occupation, some kind of regime, temporary government is going to have to be the removal of Hamas. And I don't think American men and women are going to fight and die to do that. So it's going to be quite some time before that would even look feasible. I also don't understand why the Palestinians would be at all sympathetic to the idea of having a Western power ruling their lives. Just as much as it would be even difficult to bring the Palestinian Authority to Gaza, which are other Palestinians. I think it is even, or other schemes that we've heard about in the past of the UAE or some kind of Berlin-style division of Gaza between different Arab powers. I think it is even less likely that Palestinians are likely to want to have Western countries ruling their lives in some kind of neo-colonial military occupation.
What is your view, Nabeel, that the United States could take over Gaza, albeit temporarily?
Not directly. I agree with Sarah. There's no chance that there would be American boots on the ground or direct U.S. administration. What Trump means when he says he'd like to own Gaza is own it financially. In other words, once the Palestinians are cleared out one way or another, the reconstruction he would take charge with what he hopes would be Gulf money coming in. And he and his billionaire friends would take the contracts. In terms of ruling Gaza, I mean, this is reminiscent of what happened to the Native Americans when they were fought until they were practically decimated and then pushed onto reservations. And an authority was created over them that the U.S. government could deal with. They have Mahmoud Abbas, who has been very pliant. But as Sarah pointed out, even that would be very difficult to bring to Gaza. In the end, the U.S. and Israel are all-powerful right now in the region. Nobody is standing in their way, and they are going to do whatever they want to do.
Very, very quickly, we've got very little time left. President Trump heads to the region. He'd be hosting a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Very quickly, what are your expectations?
Well, I think, first of all, it's money. He is hoping to announce a big deal, a huge arms deal and also investments in Saudi Arabia. He's hoping to announce a deal even in principle with Iran from there. Meanwhile, the Yemenis are starving just south of the border, and I don't think anything will be done about that.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to both of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington.